Republicans are getting ready to propose a budget in 2025. What's going to be in that budget, and what will it do to the federal deficit and the federal debt? Joining the podcast to discuss these questions are two of my favorite budget gurus, my favorite budget policy folks. Jessica Riedl is a senior fellow of budget, tax, and economic policy at the Manhattan Institute. And Ben Ritz is the vice president of policy development for the Progressive Policy Institute. They're both some of the most educated folks I know on the budget, and they joined the podcast to talk about the state of the budget, the state of our debt problem, and what might happen in the next few years. Do we have the political will necessary to address the debt problem, or will we keep passing the buck? What's going to happen under the Trump administration? We discuss all this and more in this episode. As always, thank you for listening. If you enjoy the podcast, you can support us by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org. Join a local chapter, get involved, join our community Slack, get access to bonus episodes of the podcast. It's the best way to support us. cnliberalism.org. Thank you for listening one more time, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today are Jessica Riedl and Ben Ritz. Jessica, Ben, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so today we are discussing the budget, the federal budget. This is going to be an increasingly important topic as we get further and further along in the year. The first question I want to ask is basically about this, where this state of things is right now. And let's take this at kind of a 10,000-foot view in terms of what is the state of the federal budget from 2024 moving into 2025. I know that the government has now passed something called a continuing resolution. Can you tell us what that is? And can you tell us what big changes the Republican majorities in Congress are looking to make in when they try to pass a more full budget later this year? In a very broad sense, what are we looking at for people who don't follow this very closely?
The deficit right now is $1.8 trillion a year and growing. It's headed towards $3.6 trillion under current policies over the next decade. So everything that's happening in the federal budget right now is in the background and context of growing deficits. The bill that Congress just passed was a continuing resolution. What that essentially did was it took the 1/3 of federal spending that goes to discretionary programs like defense, veterans health care, K-12 education, and essentially continued it at last year's spending levels for the rest of the year. Probably with a little more flexibility for the president than if Congress had actually written full appropriations bills, adding in the amounts and directives for each agency. So spending levels are going to be about the same for discretionary spending. Some tweaks here and there, but there'll be a little more flexibility for the White House and for DOJ in terms of how they spend the money. In terms of where we are beyond that, the House and Senate have both passed a budget resolution that sets a framework for the next 10 years, but really in practice just sets up a reconciliation instruction for taxes and mandatory spending, the stuff that's not covered in the continuing resolution. And right now they're debating that. It looks like Republicans want to cut taxes by about $4.5 trillion over the next decade, and maybe address mandatory spending with about $1.5 trillion in savings, but they're still trying to decide that. So they can't go and do the tax cuts until they pass this budget. They're negotiating it now.
It's interesting that you mentioned Doge there because that's been the subject of a lot of, I'll say, commentary, a lot of hand wringing from Democrats, a lot of celebratory, exclamations from MAGA world. And I think probably the most important question to ask about Doge, about the Department of Governmental Efficiency, is is Doge working, I guess, is the most important question. I'm someone who is, temperamentally favorable to the idea that we need to increase government efficiency, to the idea that, there probably is some waste in a lot of these programs. There's probably spending that is not very efficient or that's set up badly. But is Doge the kind of thing, is what Elon Musk and his team doing, is that actually going to have any appreciable effect on the federal budget?
So I can say, as a fiscal conservative, you would think I would be supporting Doge. Instead, as a fiscal conservative, I'm highly critical because I don't think it's actually a serious attempt to rein in spending and waste. I call it government spending cut theater. Ultimately, they're not going after where the real spending is. They're not even going after where the real waste is. Mostly, Doge has been targeting DEI contracts, political pro subscriptions, federal employment, and foreign aid. These are all parts of the budget that really excite MAGA and culture warriors, but are ultimately budget dust in the context of a $1.8 trillion deficit. This is more of a culture war, a symbolic fight, than it is a war on waste. And that's why, Doge puts up these counters and says we've cut $110 billion so far. Really, they've only cut, in a verified way, about $2 billion so far, which is 1/35th of 1% of federal spending. And I would even argue that they're actually making the budget situation worse, not better. Because first off, you could argue that by gutting the IRS and likely reducing tax revenue enforcement, which the IRS has said is going to happen, they're actually going to increase deficits. I would also say another problem is they're spreading a lot of misinformation. Doge claims that, USAID is a money laundering operation. We spent 1.5 billion condoms to Gaza, that Social Security is paying benefits to millions of dead recipients. And they're telling voters that we can balance the budget without hard decisions just by cutting DEI contracts and political pro subscriptions, which makes it harder to do the real hard stuff like Social Security and Medicare and tax changes. All of this is not even getting into the legalities of Doge. And the reality that if you want real spending cuts, you have to go through Congress because Doge does not have the legal or constitutional authority to override appropriations laws and cut spending. So while as a fiscal conservative, there's a lot to cut, there's a lot of waste to go after, Doge is involved in government spending cut theater that is going to excite MAGA voters, but ultimately probably hike deficits by the time they're done.
Yeah, one of the things you can look at just to sanity check some of these claims by Doge about how much money they're cutting, right? It's publicly available that you can just look up what federal outlays are. How much money has the federal government actually spent in this year, and you can put it on a chart and watch the number go up. And the number for this year is exactly the same as the number for last year. You can plot 2024 versus 2025, and the two lines are exactly the same line. That no funding has been cut in any real sense.
To put a finer point on what Jessica was saying, federal employees, the federal payroll is only about $300 billion a year. So if Doge cut and fired every single federal employee, it would only reduce the deficit by about 1/6. And obviously, that's that's also assuming, you don't have those knock-on effects, like you fire all the IRS workers, so you don't actually collect any revenue, and then you're actually having a higher deficit increase. So, like, it's just completely mathematically ridiculous to think that this is gonna really make a difference in a positive way.
Now, this is something I know that both Jessica and Ben have been thinking about for many years, and it feels a little bit like a Greek tragedy playing out in slow motion because I think the last time we had a balanced budget or a budget surplus was about 25 years ago, the very end of the Bill Clinton presidency, and since that time, people have been ringing the alarm about the state of the budget for a couple decades now, and we just kind of are creeping closer to the point where Social Security is going to be run out of money, and Medicare and Medicaid costs keep increasing, and now we're in a higher interest rate environment. I kind of can't decide whether you guys are you budget wonks are more like Cassandra, the giving all the warnings that will always be ignored, or whether you're more like Sisyphus, rolling the ball up the hill, but it always falls back down on you. Like, I can't decide which ancient Greek myth is more likely appropriate.
Oh, that's a tough one. I could see either being, boy, that's a really good one. Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing that, I think we're seeing now the effects that have been warned about for all these years finally start to materialize. I think, during the Obama era and the Bush era, we didn't have very high inflation. We didn't have high interest rates. The consequences of rising debt that we were warning about were always future issues. And I think during the Biden administration really was the first time since the Clinton era where the markets reacted and the economy reacted to these higher deficits in a way that consumers could actually feel. There's been some good research on this. Jason Furman's uplifted some of it. The Yale Budget Lab recently put out a report about how permanently higher deficits are going to affect inflation and cost families, thousands of dollars in the future. These are real costs that we're finally starting to see, but it also doesn't seem like that boulder is staying on top of the hill at this time. It's still the same conversations about how to make the problem worse, not better.
Well, and Jessica, let me ask you for an elaboration here because Ben and I are kind of on the Democratic side of the ledger, and I don't hide that I'm a Democrat, and it is who I am, and I know you've been in conservative world for quite a long time, and this is something you care about a lot. You've worked on various presidential campaigns and putting together budget policy for people at very high level in Republican circles, and how does it make you feel that you've now got a two-term Republican president and a Republican majority, and this is the level of kind of fiscal responsibility we're seeing with them is $4 to $5 trillion in tax cuts that are pretty much just not going to be offset.
It actually doesn't surprise me. Having worked for the last quarter of a century in high-level Republican politics, I've seen from the inside that a lot of the talk on spending is a bluff. Republicans talk about we're going to cut taxes and cut spending, and whenever they get control of the government, the first thing they do is cut taxes, and the spending cuts never come. And you saw this under President Bush. You had big tax cuts, and then you had a big spending spree for discretionary spending, wars, farm subsidies, Medicare D. Then you move up to 2017 when Trump gets elected. You have a big tax cut, and a unified Republican government turns around and essentially repeals the spending caps in the Budget Control Act, increasing discretionary appropriations by 13% in 1 year. And now this year, it looks like we're probably facing a similar outcome. I think the sad reality is Republicans talk a good game on spending, but they never have the votes to cut it. And I wrote an op-ed in Reason the last few weeks that Republicans rely so heavily on budget gimmicks because For their base, spending cuts are popular in the abstract, but unpopular in practice. They love to hear, we're going to cut spending, we're going to cap spending, we're going to balance the budget. But when that turns out to mean we have to address Social Security, Medicare, defense, the border, Republicans say, well, not that. Just get rid of foreign aid or immigrant spending, the stuff that doesn't make much of a difference. So what Republicans do is they promise big things and then they use a lot of budget gimmicks to make it look like they're cutting it when they don't. And that's why ultimately my career has shifted somewhat. Instead of trying to push Republicans into pushing conservative fantasy land kind of cuts when they control government, I'm more focused on trying to bring the parties together for a bipartisan deal, everything on the table, spending and taxes, because that's how both parties can actually pass something. When you give each other the bipartisan cover of putting everything on the table. We've tried this with Republican control of government. It doesn't work.
I'll just add one point there that, I think this dynamic that you're describing among Republicans is increasingly a political problem for them because, the urge to cut taxes has always been a part of Republican policy for the last 40 or 50 years. But as you said, the urge to cut spending programs is a lot more, show but don't actually do. And especially as the Republican coalition kind of polarizes itself into the more rural, more, reliant on non-college educated voters, as education polarization becomes increasingly a thing, it's increasingly the Republican base who is dependent on Medicare and Medicaid and some of these Social Security disability programs, for instance. And I think you even see people like Steve Bannon, speaking out and saying, "Hey, you can't cut these programs. That's our base." So it's a pickle that I don't think they know quite how to get out of.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, Republicans aren't even likely going to be able to cut Medicaid this year. Uh, Historically, you would think Republicans love to cut welfare spending and anti-poverty spending. But the $880 billion in Medicaid savings that the House Republicans are pushing for in their budget resolution would require virtually every Republican on a party line vote. And you have Republican lawmakers in lower income districts like Valadeo in California saying, I can't cut Medicaid because my people benefit. It is a low.
We actually just did we just recorded an episode that will have released before this one with Richie Torres, and Torres and Valadeo are the two highest percentage of Medicaid enrollees. I think Valadeo's district is something like 70% of the population in his district is on Medicaid. For Torres, it's like 65%. Yeah.
The Republican coalition is older and lower income than it used to be, and that makes it even harder to cut spending.
So what is the scenario that we're looking at over the next 5 to 10 years? And I guess I'll ask this in a sort of baseline case. If we don't really do anything, if we keep running deficits, let's assume that Republicans don't actually get to pass, $5 trillion worth of tax cuts, but let's also assume they don't really fix anything. I'll throw this one at you, Ben. What are we looking at in terms of when do things start to really, really get bad? Is there going to be a tipping point, or is there just, things will continue to get worse in kind of a linear way, and and at some point, we start getting higher inflation? What starts to happen over the next 5 to 10 years if we do nothing about the budget deficit?
So over the next decade, if the TCJA is allowed to expire, or they were to fully offset whatever they pass, we're looking at deficits that are about, right now they're about $2 trillion. They'll rise in nominal terms, but they'll be about flat as a percentage of GDP. So as a percent of economic output, they'll remain around 6% of GDP. We've had that before during economic crises. During the Obama era, that was the early Obama era in the fallout from the financial crisis. That wasn't terribly uncommon, but it's unprecedented to have something like that, to have a 6% of GDP deficit during a year of, around or below 4% unemployment, let alone have them be persistently at that high level. And so that is going to, that puts inflationary pressure on the economy. That's going to crowd out private investment. It'll push for higher interest rates. So it's going to have really bad effects over the coming years. But again, this all assumes that TCJA is allowed to expire. If it continues, this assumes they only continue it without offset. They could even expand it with some of these new proposals, like no tax on tips, and so you could be looking at deficits that are north of 7% of GDP in the worst case scenarios, even further. And so that's going to be even worse. Right now, CBO is projecting that 30 years from now. So right now we're already at a debt to GDP ratio that's about, debt relative to the size of our annual economic output. That's about 100%. It's near or at the all-time high it's ever been. Over the next 30 years, no TCJA, we're looking at about 150% of GDP. But CBO recently put out an analysis that showed if TCJA is extended without offset, and that's just TCJA, it's going to be over 200% of GDP. So that means that our debt is going to be more than twice the size of our annual economic output. And they also, interestingly, modeled a scenario where interest rates are higher than expected just by 1 percentage point. And under that scenario, their model actually can't produce much beyond 2050. It can't go out the full 30-year window because it's projecting a debt to GDP ratio over 250%. And they're not sure that at those kind of debt levels, their model actually holds. They don't even know if they hold at those levels, but even higher, they're less sure. So, I mean, we're looking at really, a bad situation over the next decade and a really, really bad situation over the next 2 or 3.
Yeah, and to jump in here, to echo much of what Ben said, it's hard to say, oh, the deficit's going to really hit the economy in 11 years. We don't know that, but we can say, as Ben said, the debt has historically been about 40% of GDP since World War II. It's 100% of GDP right now, and if you extend out current policies, it's going to about 240% of GDP if interest rates stay low, and by my model, close to 300% of GDP if interest rates rise over 30 years. At that point, interest would consume nearly 100% of our tax revenues every year. Just the interest, all tax revenues. Obviously, that's not feasible.
I mean, so because what you get, just to spell it out for people who are not macroeconomists, right? You're in a situation it's totally unprecedented. This is like beyond even Japan levels.
Yes.
And essentially, if 100% of your tax revenue is going to interest payments, the only option you have is you're either going to hike up taxes all at once very rapidly, which can crash the economy. If you double taxes overnight, that's probably not a good idea. Or you end up printing money to pay for the rest of the government that is not the interest payments. And, once you start down the road of just, well, we're just going to print money and fund, several, $10 trillion of government spending every year that way. That's the Argentina method, which, maybe it has its advocates, but I don't think it's a very good idea.
Yeah, let's look at this from the perspective of the financial markets. Right now, the national debt's about $29 trillion, the debt held by the public. If you count intergovernmental debt, it's higher, but the debt held by the public is $29 trillion. Over the next 30 years under current policy, the debt rises to $200 trillion in 30 years. Now, that's not adjusted for inflation. You can subtract about a third of that if you adjust for inflation. But the point is, who is going to lend Washington $200 trillion? China and Japan each hold $1 trillion of American debt, and they're stagnant, if not trying to decline their or decrease their holdings. Furthermore, their economies do not even have the capacity to make much of a dent in a debt going to 200 trillion. Other nations,
Well, Jessica, it's a very good thing we've got so many great allies that we haven't pissed off around the world, right? There's no reason anybody would be mad at us right now.
of course, and even if they weren't mad at us, the other countries aren't gonna, our economy is so big that when our debt gets up that big, other countries don't have the capacity. That means, let's say we go to 200 trillion, you're going to need the vast majority of that to come from domestic lending. That means Wall Street, insurance funds, mutual funds, state and local governments. It's going to be really hard for our government to find $200 trillion to borrow over the next 30 years without interest rates going way up and without soaking up all the savings in the economy that now can no longer go for home loans, car loans, business startup loans. So you start to see interest rates rise. You start to see the economy starved of investment, and the government gets caught in this spiral where interest rates rise, so they have to borrow more, which pushes up interest rates higher. And this is why when the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School, about a year and a half ago, projected out the 30-year economy under current debt trends, their model crashed. Just like CBO, their model crashed. They could not project a functioning economy over the next 30 years. Now, we don't know if that means the problems really blow up in 8 years or 12 years or 18 years. We just know that between now and 30 years, something has to give. And the time to address that is now. You don't wait until you already have the debt. You have to implement the changes now before it's too late.
Well, I mean, the problem, like you said, is, you said earlier that you've shifted towards thinking about bipartisan solutions because when one party has power, look, the best time to address the budget deficit is not right now. The best time to address it is the next guy, right? The next guy in power should definitely be responsible and address it. I should spend as much money as I want. That's kind of how every administration, every Congress seems to treat this, right?
It's actually even worse than that. I remember hearing during the Obama era, first term, you got to get reelected, but the second term, that's when you have the flexibility to do deficit reduction. I think a lot of people look back at Bill Clinton balancing the budget in his second term and think like, okay, you can do good budget stuff in your second term. But then, that didn't really happen. The grand bargain kind of died right around then. And then Trump comes in and does this big deficit finance tax cut. And all the Republicans said, well, that's just to get reelected. We might do entitlement reform in the second term. Well, now here we are in this Trump second term, and there is no evidence that there's some secret deficit reduction plan they're going to roll out. Like they're clearly just going to keep making it worse. Maybe next time they'll say, the next guy's going to be able to do it. Said the same thing with Joe Biden, by the way. This term, got to do the big social spending to get Joe Biden a second term. But, we could do the budget, the harder budget trade-offs in the second term that obviously never happened. There's just always an excuse to push it one term more.
Do you agree then, Ben? Do you agree with Jessica that the only way out of this is going to have to be some sort of bipartisan, like grand compromise where the parties essentially give each other cover to make something happen?
I think so. I mean, I just don't see another way around it. The last time we had a big partisan deficit reduction bill, Democrats will say, oh, the IRA and, Obamacare were nominally deficit reducing. And, they were, but, kind of rounding error levels. They were basically like paid for bills. They weren't big deficit reduction bills. The last big party line deficit reduction bill was in Bill Clinton's first term. And Democrats did this in his first year. It's a big tax increase. And I think Democrats look back at that as, we walked the plank, lost the House for the first time in 40 years. And what was our reward for that? Well, when Republicans took over, they spent all of the savings on tax cuts. It seems like the only durable deficit reduction is deficit reduction that is done on a bipartisan basis. And even then, that might not be durable. We saw Trump squander a lot of the bipartisan Obama era savings. But, at a bare minimum, there's going to have to be bipartisan buy-in in the moment for there to be any hope of bipartisan buy-in long term.
This is a long time ago, but the model to me is the 1983 Social Security reforms. In 1983, the Social Security Trust Fund was heading to bankruptcy, and Republicans had tried a more partisan approach, and it didn't work. So ultimately, Republicans and Democrats got together. They created the Greenspan Commission to address the Social Security insolvency, and it was so bipartisan that Reagan and Democratic House Speaker Tip O'Neill had a gentleman's agreement that they would not criticize each other's solution at any point in the Social Security reform process. Imagine that today. The leader of both parties on an issue as controversial as Social Security pledging not to publicly attack the other's solutions. It was remarkable. And ultimately, the parties came together. They passed a series of tax and spending and eligibility age changes to Social Security. It passed bipartisan. And you know what? Reagan was reelected in a landslide. Tip O'Neill was reelected. There was no big landslide loss in the 1984 elections. Both sides gave each other political cover, and the critics had nowhere else to go because both parties passed it together, and both sides got reelected. It seems like this is in another era. This may as well have been in the dinosaur era with this degree of bipartisanship. But ultimately, that's what it takes to get it done.
I agree. This is a different era, and I wonder if we still have what it takes, just in the sense that, polarization is so high now, way, way higher than the 1980s when you still had, conservative Democrats and fairly liberal Republicans in some districts. And, we hadn't completely transformed our politics into the clean ideological lines that we have now. With the parties are actually much more ideological right now than they have been at any point in the past 50 or 60 years. There used to be a lot more crossing of ideologies, but now everybody is pretty much in line on the two teams.
I'm gonna dispute that because people say this that we're is more partisan than ever, more ideological than ever. I think I was actually on a panel with Jessica when I first disputed this, but I think that really peaked in 2012. I think I'm for small. We have a cohesive vision of small government, and we have a cohesive vision of big government. That partisan split really peaked in 2012. I think if you look at the Republican side of the aisle on economic policy, it is actually a lot less cohesive than it used to be back then. And on the one hand, that kind of creates a little more space on their side. On the other, it means that, whereas we used to have two parties that wanted to kind of do deficit reduction or at least pay for government in different ways, one with spending cuts and one with tax increases, you now have Democrats kind of more in alignment, and Republicans, even if they didn't have the political challenges of having to compete with Democrats, they probably couldn't agree on how to balance the budget amongst themselves.
Yeah, it is interesting that when the Democrats have passed things, I will say they've at least nodded at deficit reduction sometimes. It's not like Joe Biden was good for the federal debt, but like you said, the IRA, I think it was nominally a budget deficit bill and a budget deficit reducing bill. And again, part of the Obamacare stuff was nominally, going to reduce the deficit, and Democrats at least gesture in that direction, even if they're not accomplishing that much. Republicans, I don't see even making much gesture. They're very happy to just cut taxes, but that seems to be where we are, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think this goes back to Jessica's, budget cut theater comment. They do gesture with their rhetoric. I mean, Elon Musk says, so we got to do something about Social Security, or it's gonna engulf the whole budget. But he's not talking about right sizing benefit, aligning benefit and tax levels so that they're sustainable. He's talking about cutting benefit payments to ghosts that aren't actually going out. And so they give lip service to it. They gesture to it. They just don't do anything about it other than make it worse.
It's interesting. I agree with Ben that Republicans, if anything, are moving leftward on spending, as you alluded to as well earlier, Jeremiah, because they used to at least talk more about entitlement reform. I mean, I was good friends with Paul Ryan back when Republicans were talking about Medicare and Social Security, and now you have President Trump threatening Republicans that you better not touch Social Security and Medicare.
Well, and this was his big innovation all the way back in 2016. I think a lot of people forget that. I think one of the reasons he got elected, he won that primary, is that you had a field of 12 or 13 Republicans all saying we gotta figure out ways to cut Social Security and Medicare. And Trump said, "Hell no, I'm not going to do that. I love Social Security. It's my favorite."
Yeah.
And he was the only one who did that. I don't think it's an accident that was a politically popular thing for him to do.
Yeah, at the time in 2017, there was a survey that showed only 15% of Republicans supported Medicare reform, and only 10% of Republicans supported Social Security reform. So, Paul Ryan had charged up the hill, turned around, and found that there was no army behind him. And Trump showed that Republicans, for all their talk about cutting spending, they want to cut other people's spending. They want to cut spending to immigrants, foreigners, and people in the cities. But Social Security can't be touched. Medicare can't be touched. Veterans benefits can't be touched. Defense can't be touched. Not even farm subsidies, which are just as much of a welfare handout as any anti-poverty program, can't be touched by Republicans because that's benefits to them. And to a certain degree, I think their bluff is getting called a little bit more these days. That, look, even when Republicans have all the power, they can't cut anything. And that's why I keep defaulting back to we need bipartisan cover, because deficit reduction isn't easy for anybody. And to say this, in fact, to hit Democrats on this too, Democrats talk obsessively about taxing the rich, but when a Democratic government comes in, you don't see huge taxes on the rich getting enacted either. As much as Republicans are bluffing on spending cuts, Democrats are mostly bluffing on corporate taxes and taxing the rich. You had a few tweaks under Biden, kind of a new corporate AMT, but really both sides kind of bluff on this stuff and can't pass it themselves. And you really need to get everyone together on this, which I agree with you. There's really no way to see both sides sitting down together these days like they had in the past.
At least not under President Trump. I think this is something that is going to have to wait, unfortunately, for the post-Trump era. There seems to be no political way in which Democrats can make any sort of agreement with the Trump administration and survive. So that's we'll see what happens in 2028. Who knows whether we'll have President J.D. Vance or some Democrat. There's dozens of people who might be running, but it's potentially grim because we are running out the clock that we don't really have a lot of. And, in addition to the rest of the budget, we know that Social Security may be, become insolvent in what is it, like 2035? You guys would know better than I would. And at that point, just either seniors get their checks cut, or we fix something, or it just kind of automatically happens. Part of me wonders if 2035 might really be kind of an inflection point when you have to do something about Social Security, and that causes reflection on the rest of the budget as well.
I mean, I think the Social Security insolvency date is going to be the decision point, because I think there's still a force undergirding the markets that says, well, the U.S. is running these unsustainable deficits now, but they'll eventually get their act together. And I think if we solve the Social Security trust fund insolvency by just borrowing the money, doing an open-ended general revenue transfer, which I think is kind of like politically the easiest thing to do. And I think a lot of people, especially on the left, are sort of banking on it to happen. I think that's the signal to the markets of, this is just going to go on forever. And you could really see that being the, quote unquote bond vigilante moment. We've already seen some kind of soft versions of that over the last couple of years, but I think that would really be the big decision point. On the flip side, if we use that as the opportunity to actually get our shit together, then that may be when we fix it. So I think that's really going to be a big inflection point.
All right. Well, we are coming up on time here soon, so I want to ask the traditional final question that we often ask on this podcast, and that is, where can people go to learn more? If they're interested in what we've been talking about today, if they're interested in learning more about the state of the deficit and the federal budget, if they're interested in the process of passing a federal budget or what's in the federal budget or what the plans are for the different parties, what projections look like, all this good stuff, what would you recommend for listeners who want to learn more? And this could be, other podcasts to listen to, blog posts, resources to use for research, books, anything that you think would help educate people who care about this topic. Jessica, I'll kick it off to you first.
Sure. Well, first I'll do my own obligatory self-promotion. If you Google Jessica Riedl, Manhattan Institute, you can find all of my articles, studies. In fact, if you Google Jessica Riedl chart book or Manhattan Institute chart book, I have 135 pages of charts on the federal budget, most of which defy conventional wisdom. So, and also on Twitter at Jessica B. Riedl. Beyond that, I think you have really good think tanks. Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is very good. The Progressive Policy Institute is very good. And I'm a big fan of going to the primary sources. The Congressional Budget Office is really the place to go for budget projections. And the Office of Management
and Doge hasn't destroyed them yet.
Not
Elon
yet.
Musk has not gotten his paws on the CBO yet.
Go there while they exist. Go there while they still exist. The OMB historical tables can give you past budget numbers. Those are places I go. I spend much of my day on the OMB historical tables and the CBO website. But there's also great think tanks translating it too.
I think Jessica kind of hit on the major evergreen sources. I'll just plug a couple. The Yale Budget Lab study that I mentioned about inflation, I think is a really good eye opener. Jason Furman had a really good piece in FP about sort of the consequences of fiscal overreach and a few other things during the Biden era. I think that came out this month or last month. That was very good. So those are kind of the first two things I would recommend, other than the resources Jessica already said, which is what I would have said if I'd gone first.
It's funny, whenever I talk with Ben about the budget or with other different budget wonks, budget gurus, I always feel like I should offer my condolences because it never feels like it's good news. It never feels like, oh, we've made good progress on the budget. It's always just, no, we're one step closer to the disaster that we all know is coming, and it's not here yet, but one more step. And then the next time I talk to them, it's one more step. And, I feel like I should be like offering you like, sympathy, counseling, therapy. I don't know.
Yeah, I know this is a podcast, which makes it not possible, but there should be an open bar when we're discussing topics this depressing.
Next time we'll all have drinks. We'll all have a couple drinks beforehand and see if that makes the conversation even spicier. But I do want to thank my guests one more time before we get out of here. Jessica Riedl, Ben Ritz, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for having us.